Well, the votes are in. Claudia Sheinbaum is Mexico's new president. This is a significant milestone for the nation, and people are hopeful that she's the change they've all been waiting for. However, her victory has been overshadowed by one dark reality: the ever-present cartel violence that has been plaguing Mexico's politics for decades, which at best can be incidents of bribery or intimidation, and, at worst, the straight-up assassination of candidates running for office. And you might even be inclined to believe that these are just one-offs that happen every once in a blue moon. But then, you look at the numbers, and the shocking truth finally starts to set in. Between 2000 and 2017, 156 people met their fate while trying to bring about some much-needed change by running for public office. And while these stats are horrifying, things have gotten even more out of hand recently, with one candidate even being taken out in broad daylight just mere days before Claudia Sheinbaum's win. So what do key players like Trump and Biden think about this mess? And, more importantly, what's their game plan to help Mexico usher in an era of peace and stability? Stay tuned as we dig deep into the wild world of cartel politics, as well as the international efforts to combat it. So Claudia Sheinbaum's big win in Mexico is pretty historic. Not only is she the first woman to ever be president in Mexico, but she's also the first Jewish person to do so too. Imagine the impact of that. And her victory wasn't even a tight race. In fact, she won by a landslide.
Felicito a todas y a todos los mexicanos que el día de hoy, con su participación, demostramos que México es un país democrático con elecciones pacíficas.
Over 60% of voters supported Claudia Sheinbaum, while her main competitor only got 30%. This overwhelming support shows that the people of Mexico are in dire need of a fresh political leadership. Claudia Sheinbaum's background is pretty interesting too. She's a climate scientist and has been pretty active in the progressive student movements in Mexico. For instance, she's all about environmental protection and clean energy, which is why she's extremely popular amongst Mexico's younger generation of voters.
Sheinbaum may make, I think, important changes on energy policy, on fiscal policy, potentially on the environment.
She's even vouched to carry on Mexico's ex-president Andrés Manuel López Obrador's long-term plans for the country, which means that Mexico's transition from one president to another will be a pretty smooth ride.
She's been by Andrés Manuel López Obrador's side for the past 24 years, one of his closest political allies.
But that's not to say that there aren't any concerns. And although many are optimistic about the future of Mexico, some critics argue that her political party, Morena, has grown so big that it's drowning out other voices. This could lead to fears that the dominant party might actually be the one stifling any democratic debate and even marginalizing the opposition. Sheinbaum's victory also has a cultural and religious significance. We all know that Mexico is predominantly Roman Catholic, so having a Jewish president is a big deal. It shows growing acceptance of religious diversity. That being said, there's been a growing trend in other Latin American countries lately. Countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina have seen an increased representation of women and other minorities in political leadership. Now, that might not sound like much, but when you think about it, it's a pretty clear indicator that there's been a shift of priorities all throughout the continent.
Also you're seeing increasingly indigenous people and indigenous political parties elected. A number of different groups that didn't traditionally tend to hold power have tended to see their representation expand because of democracy. So I think that that's one thing which we can point to as a real advance and as honestly a strong point for Latin America.
So what's going to happen now? One crucial area to watch is how Sheinbaum's presidency will affect U.S.-Mexico relations, especially the immigration policies and border enforcement. We all know that Mexico has been ramping up efforts to curb rampant illegal immigration, a trend that could either continue or change under Claudia Sheinbaum's new rule. And when you stop to think that U.S. policies might even become stricter, especially with a potential second Trump administration, things could get tense in an instant. Thankfully, she's very aware of this, and she's even vouched to see to it that connections remain strong.
Con los Estados Unidos habrá una relación de amistad, respeto mutuo e igualdad como hasta ahora ha sido, y siempre defenderemos a las y a los mexicanos que se encuentran del otro lado de la frontera.
But despite her win, however, Claudia Sheinbaum's incredible victory is overshadowed by one thing, and one thing only, and that's Mexico's famous drug cartels and their endless reign of terror. So the new administration will have one truly massive task to handle, and that's addressing these violent threats in order to ensure that democracy can thrive. The power some of these guys wield almost matches that of a president. It's because of this very fact that Mexico's political life still poses a lot of risks, and running for office can be life-threatening. And you're probably thinking that Mexican drug cartels wouldn't dare touch someone so public while the whole world is watching, that these acts of extreme violence are a thing of the past. But you'd be wrong. What if I told you that the latest political candidate to pay the ultimate price for standing up for what's right was assassinated just days ahead of Claudia Sheinbaum's presidential victory? The man's name was Alfredo Cabrera, and it all happened in broad daylight too, all while he was surrounded by his very own eager supporters. So, how can something like this ever be allowed to happen? May 30th, 2024. It's a sunny afternoon in Coyuca de Benitez, a town in Guerrero, Mexico. Alfredo Cabrera, a candidate for mayor known for his strong stance against corruption, is in the middle of a campaign rally, surrounded by his cheering supporters. People around him are ecstatic, hopeful for a much-needed change of scenery from the troubled and corrupt system that's been making their life a living hell. And Cabrera is there, passionately speaking about a better future for his beloved community. Then, suddenly, amidst the crowd, a young man in a wheelchair starts moving towards him. No one suspects anything, and why would they? But in a split second, everything changes. The young man, who's about 20 to 25 years old, suddenly stands up and shoots Cabrera in the back of the head. The crowd is stunned, horrified. Cabrera collapses, and the place is thrown into an all-too-familiar state of chaos. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a calculated move by the cartels to eliminate a candidate who threatened their strong grip on local politics. In his quest for making his community a safer place for everyone, Alfredo Cabrera ended up having to pay the ultimate price for it. News of this incident traveled fast, and people were enraged that such a crime can take place in broad daylight. They were enraged, but they weren't shocked. Cabrera's assassination was not an isolated incident. Just hours before, Noé Ramos, another candidate, was brutally stabbed in Tamaulipas, and on the same day, a candidate in Oaxaca was found dead after being missing for 2 days. It's a scary pattern, with over 30 candidates killed in the run-up to the elections.
We have had a worsening of conflict realities. You've had a phenomenon in which criminal groups have been effectively given the leeway over this government and also the past one.
But why are these cartels so desperate to control local politics? It's all about power and influence. Local officials are key players. They control things like budgets, law enforcement, and policies. So, by intimidating or even flat out eliminating their opponents, cartels ensure that only those who will cooperate with them or turn a blind eye to their activities get into power.
The number of groups to begin with, criminal groups that we have active in Mexico, had already exploded to a number of at least 200. So it's a bit of a hornet's nest, and criminal conflict and criminal predation as well has become something largely self-perpetual that the government has found very, very hard to control.
The assassination of Alfredo Cabrera and others has sent shockwaves through Mexico. There's outrage, sadness, and a strong call for drastic action. People are tired of living in fear and are calling for real change, and rightly so. Can you even imagine seeing the political landscape in your country being turned into nothing more than an evil power struggle?
Tens of thousands of candidates all over the country in very particular positions, in very local places where the gangs operate, and they're certainly much more the target of these gangs.
So, what's been Mexico's response to all of this? Surely, they scrambled to find solutions to stop any further carnage. How about this? They've deployed over 2,700 troops to protect their 554 remaining candidates. That sounds like the appropriate answer, right? Well, there's a catch. Even the military can be infiltrated by cartel influence, so ensuring genuine security is not a piece of cake.
Now we went to a splitted government and to an organized crime that has a lot of weapons. They sometimes have more firepower than police forces, even than the army.
And then there's the justice system. Often, investigations into these political assassinations move at a snail's pace, and the guys behind these acts rarely, if ever, face justice. In Cabrera's case, the investigation is still dragging on, with lots of theories but no solid answers. This lack of accountability only boosts the cartel's confidence that they're free to do as they please. Now, imagine being Claudia Sheinbaum, the newly elected president. She's facing immense pressure to tackle this issue head-on, but it's not just about cracking down on crime. She also has to take a good, hard look at the root causes of all this violence. Things like poverty, lack of education, or limited economic opportunities, they all need to be addressed. But if looking at Mexico's decades-long struggle against cartel violence can tell you one thing, it's that their reign of terror is nothing new. It's been a part of Mexico's political landscape for a very long time. And so, in order to better understand the current crisis, we have to look back at how these criminal organizations first gained a foothold in the political arena and how their influence has grown many times over since. The roots of cartel influence in Mexican politics can be traced all the way back to the 1980s and 1990s, when drug trafficking organizations began to gain significant power and control over various regions of the country. During this tough period, the Mexican government's policies were often marked by corruption at best and complicity at worst, allowing cartels to flourish and embed themselves deeply within the political system. This era, often referred to as Mexico's narco state period, was characterized by high-level collusion between government officials, law enforcement, and military personnel with drug trafficking organizations that were beginning to gain incredible amounts of wealth and power. One of the most notorious figures from this era is Genaro Garcia Luna, a man who used to be Mexico's own former top law enforcement official. Garcia Luna made a habit out of accepting bribes from the cartels. And don't you think we're talking about some pennies here and there?
Prosecutors called in former members of the cartel to testify against Luna. They claimed he received more than $200 million in bribes.
The man was eventually arrested and convicted for both taking bribes from, as well as helping the Sinaloa cartel smuggle tons of drugs, which was under the leadership of the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman at the time. Under Garcia Luna's administration, federal law enforcement agencies were not just complicit, but actively involved in supporting these cartel operations. And to give you an idea of just how bad things got, witnesses even testified that Mexico's law enforcement would unload cocaine shipments for the cartel. So not only did they have these guys by their side, they were their actual employees. Not only that, but corruption of this magnitude is bound to eventually extend far beyond Mexico's own borders. So if you ever wonder how the cartels managed to seep into the US, then look no further than the very fruitful cooperation between law enforcement agents and these gangs. And remember, when I mentioned that few people are ever brave enough to get into the political game out of fear of retaliation, beyond the political and law enforcement sectors, cartels have also sought to exert control over local governments. Many qualified individuals are then deterred from running for office due to the threat of violence, leaving a void that is often filled by candidates who are either willing to collaborate with cartels or lack the capacity to challenge them. So not only are they scaring away well-intended candidates, but they're also directly financing the campaigns of those who will look after their interests.
Apparently gave something on the order of $2 million through people on his payroll to people in the campaign logistics operation. One of those operatives ended up becoming a confidential source and an active collaborator of the DEA investigation.
It's a surefire way of making sure you always stay on top. And it's no wonder why cartels have stuck to fear and bribery in order to further their ruthless agendas. It's because it always works. But you know who often ends up paying dearly for the policymakers' mistakes? It's the average, everyday folk. Thousands of individuals and families have been forced to flee their homes to escape violence, adding to the flow of migrants seeking refuge in the United States.
This makeshift encampment behind me can be a lifeline for migrants crossing this treacherous terrain here along the Arizona border. You can see migrants behind me getting food, water, and basic necessities here before being transferred over to Border Patrol agents.
Daniel made the 5,000-kilometer trip with his 2 young cousins to escape gang violence and poverty back home.
So, let's talk about why the US cares so much about cartel influence in Mexico. It's not just about stopping drugs from crossing the border. It's also about a little thing called regional security. What happens in Mexico doesn't stay in Mexico. It spills over states like California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas are currently facing utter chaos at their borders due to drug trafficking.
Near El Paso, Texas. It's not just desperate families turning themselves into the Border Patrol, but adult men running away from the agents.
Mostly adults who are not seeking asylum.
This is why U.S.-Mexican cooperation is a really big deal. Without one or the other, this ongoing crisis will go on forever, and cartels will eventually take over even more territory, bringing chaos way beyond America's doorstep.
A Texas sheriff says he's greatly concerned about what a recent shootout on the U.S.-Mexico border could mean for the security of area residents.
So, what are U.S. officials planning on doing about it? Is there a new approach to this crisis that they have yet to explore? One thing's for sure, though, not everyone agrees on what the best course of action looks like. And while some ideas are pretty out there, like Trump's alleged plan to send literal kill squads straight into Mexico to deal with the drug lords themselves, others are proposing far tamer and more long-term solutions that will require a lot of time and patience. When it comes to the US-Mexico border, every inch of it is in danger of becoming a new smuggling route. And when you consider that there are over 2,000 miles of shared border in between the two, you've got one heck of a dilemma on your hands. How exactly do you prevent these crimes from taking place when you've got such a wide area to protect? Well, joining this debate is former President Donald Trump, and his approach is interesting to say the least. Trump has been particularly outspoken about the cartels over the course of time. He saw them as a direct threat to U.S. national security and frequently talked about all the devastating effects of the opioid crisis, which is largely fueled by drugs smuggled across the border.
Fentanyl, heroin, meth, and other lethal drugs are pouring across our wide-open border, stealing hundreds of thousands of beautiful American lives, and it's happening like never before in our history. Children are being left without parents, families are being ripped apart.
Trump wanted to label cartels as foreign terrorist organizations in order for him to be able to take more aggressive actions against them. He often said that his administration had significantly reduced drug trafficking by building new border barriers and increasing patrols. But critics argue that despite these measures, the flow of drugs and violence continued, suggesting a more comprehensive strategy is needed. Now, here's where it gets interesting. At one point, Trump even suggested deploying U.S. military forces to Mexico to tackle the cartel leaders head-on.
Also said recently that if you're reelected, you would send special forces and, quote, other military assets to Mexico.
It's a war on cartels. Mexico's petrified of the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico.
But if we send our troops across the southern border, you know better than I do that the Mexican
president,
if he doesn't like it, we're in a war.
I know, but well, I'm not too worried about that war.
Can you imagine? He thought about launching a series of missile strikes against them, saying it could be done secretly, but his defense secretary, Mark Esper, advised against it because of the huge diplomatic issues it would cause.
The president pulls me aside on at least a couple occasions and suggests that maybe we have the U.S. military shoot missiles into Mexico.
Shoot missiles into Mexico for what?
He would say to go after the cartels. And we would have this private discussion where I'd say, Mr. President, I understand the motive, because he was very serious about dealing with drugs in America. I get that. We all understand. But I had to explain to him, we can't do that.
Now, while Trump's strategy is nothing short of ridiculous, since it would entail overstepping a sovereign country's boundaries, President Biden's approach seems to be the exact opposite. His administration focuses on strengthening cooperation with Mexico and other Central American countries to address the root causes of migration and cartel influence. What this basically means is promoting economic development, enhancing law enforcement collaboration, and supporting anti-corruption initiatives. During a press briefing, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked why Biden seemed comfortable with cartels operating close to the U.S.
Let me take on the drug part here, because since you brought this up,
because of the work that this president has done, because of what we've done specifically on fentanyl at the border, it's at historic lows, historic levels that we have been able to record a number of personnel working to secure the border because of what we've been able to do. Seizing that fentanyl, we've done it in a historic way.
Biden's team seems to be noticing another crucial element here, and that's why these drugs are getting into the U.S. in the first place. In many respects, drug cartels are similar to any other business. So let me ask you this. What would they do if they lost all their customers?
Top of that, historic sanctions going after traffickers and other financiers are helping disrupt fentanyl supply chains throughout their flow to the U.S. And we're really expanded access to treatments like that are saving lives.
Biden's team seems to be wondering the same thing, which is why they say they're working on reducing drug demand in the U.S. by expanding their addiction treatment programs and increasing the availability of life-saving medications like naloxone, a drug that can stop you from overdosing on opioids. So the idea behind all of this is to weaken the financial power of the cartels by cutting off a large chunk of their market. But can they really make that happen before it's too late? Take the current fentanyl crisis, for instance. It's been going on for a while now, and people are already experiencing the devastating consequences of this synthetic drug that's being smuggled into the U.S. at an alarming pace.
Next to the fentanyl crisis wreaking havoc in communities across the country, the overdoses, drug seizures, and concerns continue to grow from coast to coast.
It is a disturbing trend we've seen. Fentanyl deaths have skyrocketed in recent years, and 2 years ago this week, 3 people in New York City died from an overdose of the drug. They all bought the drug from the same dealer. Their family still looking to come to terms with the loss.
No matter which side you're on here, one thing remains clear: the current U.S.-Mexico border crisis is deeply complex. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that a very strong strategy in dealing with this tricky issue needs to be put forth. The actual challenge here is finding the right balance between aggressive measures to combat cartels and comprehensive policies to address the socioeconomic factors that are actually driving this trade. The U.S. approach has sometimes strained relations with Mexico. For instance, Trump's idea to label cartels as terrorist organizations didn't go down well with Mexican President AMLO.
El señor legislador, sí, es un irrespetuoso. Nosotros somos un país independiente, libre, soberano. No somos colonia, no somos protectorado de ningún país extranjero.
Now, no one's really sure why, but the plan was eventually put on hold as both countries tried to find some common ground. AMLO once suggested a peace deal with the cartels, which is controversial. It might reduce violence, but could also legitimize criminal groups. If Sheinbaum considers this, it must be carefully managed. This back and forth between US and Mexican policies means that what happens on one side of the border will always affect the other. So there can be no rushed decisions or fear-driven responses from either side if they really want to make it work. Does the US want a peaceful border? Does Mexico want to bring peace to its most vulnerable communities? Mexico's been figuring things out on their side of the border as well. And with the conclusion of a historic election and Claudia Sheinbaum set to take office, the future of Mexico hangs in a delicate balance. Her presidency predicts some pretty significant changes, but it also comes with substantial challenges. So as she prepares to navigate these turbulent waters, let's explore the possible scenarios that could unfold in Mexico's near future. To make real change, she'll need a mix of strong law enforcement and programs to tackle the reasons people turn to crime. First, she might shift from AMLO's military focus to strengthening Mexico's law enforcement agencies, making them more trustworthy and effective. But we all know that's a tough challenge. Next, economic development is key. Sheinbaum has expressed her desire to focus on creating more jobs for the people of Mexico. So, if Sheinbaum can create jobs and reduce poverty, fewer people might be inclined to join cartels.
She's a highly prepared woman with the responsibility to continue with this project of transformation at the national level. For more than 70 years, we have lived in injustice, especially the most disadvantaged, who make up more than 70% of the population in Mexico.
If her background in climate science is anything to go by, she might push for green jobs and environmental projects. It's basically hitting two birds with one stone. Right now, Claudia Sheinbaum is really popular, and people seem to think that she's going to do a fine job as Mexico's first woman president. But this enthusiasm that got her elected needs to continue with real improvements in people's lives. So things like transparency, effective policies, as well as addressing citizens' concerns will be key here. And here's the thing, cartel violence remains a threat to this day. We all know that, and we might just have to trust that Mexico picked the best person possible to take on these extremely complicated issues. Who knows, maybe Claudia Sheinbaum's presidency might just be the turning point that Mexico's citizens have been waiting for all along. After all, if she can navigate these challenges, then Mexico might just be entering into a new era of peace and prosperity. What do you think? Can Sheinbaum handle these issues and lead Mexico to a better future? Feel free to let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, then make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more, then click that subscribe button in order to always stay updated. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay safe.